Autumn Leaves, a story of love, loss, and second chances. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in September, just as the maple tree in my front yard began to turn. That's how I remember it now. The first hints of gold touching the edges of green leaves, a perfect metaphor for what was about to unfold in my life. My name scrawled across the envelope in handwriting I hadn't seen in 27 years, but recognized instantly. Daniel. I stood in my kitchen, coffee growing cold beside me, holding the envelope as if it might disappear if I moved too quickly. My daughter called it my empty nest year. My first autumn without children at home. Emma was in her second year at Northwestern, and Jake had finally moved into his own apartment after finishing college. At 53, I was supposed to be rediscovering myself, taking those watercolor classes I'd always talked about, maybe dating again after 6 years of divorce-induced solitude. Instead, I was frozen in place, staring at an envelope postmarked from Portland, Oregon. When I finally opened it, my hands trembled so badly I nearly tore the letter inside. Dear Elizabeth, I don't know if you still live at this address, or if you'll even read this once you see who it's from. I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away unopened. But I had to try. I've been diagnosed with a heart condition. Nothing immediately terminal, but it's made me face my mortality in ways I've been avoiding for decades. The doctors talk about getting my affairs in order, and all I can think about is you. About us. About the summer of '97 and all the promises I broke. I've spent 27 years trying to convince myself I made the right choice. I failed. I'll be visiting my sister in Cleveland next month. I know it's presumptuous to ask, but I'd like to see you, if you're willing. To explain in person. To apologize properly for what I did. My number is below if you want to reach out. If I don't hear from you, I'll understand. Daniel. I sank into a chair, the letter clutched to my chest, and let the memories wash over me like a tide I'd been holding back for nearly 3 decades. Daniel Harmon. My first real love. The man who taught me how deeply I could feel, and then showed me how completely a heart could break. Outside, a breeze stirred the maple tree, and a single golden leaf detached, spiraling down to rest on my porch. Summer of 1997, I was 26 when I met Daniel. It was at a gallery opening in downtown Cleveland. My friend Meredith had dragged me there, insisting I needed culture and possibly a date. You can't stay holed up in that apartment grading papers forever, she'd said, pulling me through the door of what turned out to be a photography exhibition. I'm not looking to meet anyone, I protested, but went along because that's what you did with Meredith. The gallery was crowded, white walls lined with black and white photographs of abandoned industrial sites. I was studying one. A massive empty steel mill with light streaming through broken windows, when a voice behind me said, "It's like a cathedral, isn't it?" I turned to find a tall man with intelligent eyes and an easy smile. He wore a gray button-down with the sleeves rolled up, exposing forearms tanned from outdoor work. Not the typical gallery patron. I was just thinking that, I admitted, surprising myself by not making an excuse to walk away. The photographer has a gift for finding sacred spaces in forgotten places, he said. His voice had a gentle cadence, as if he measured each word before releasing it. I'm Daniel, by the way. Daniel Harmon. Elizabeth Cooper, I replied, accepting his handshake. His palm was warm and calloused. Elizabeth, he repeated, as if testing the sound of my name. Are you an art enthusiast, or were you dragged here against your will like me? I laughed. The latter. My friend Meredith believes I need more exposure to cultural experiences. And what do you believe you need, Elizabeth Cooper? The directness of his question caught me off guard. Most men I met tried small talk or showed off their knowledge. Daniel just looked at me with genuine curiosity. I'm still figuring that out, I answered honestly. We spoke for over an hour, moving from photograph to photograph around the gallery, discovering shared passions for literature and hiking. He was a landscape architect with a small firm, specializing in sustainable designs. I taught high school English and dreamed of writing a novel someday. When Meredith finally found me, she raised an eyebrow and made a transparent excuse to leave me there. Daniel and I ended up at a small cafe 2 blocks away, talking until they began stacking chairs around us. That night, walking to my car under a canopy of stars, he kissed me for the first time. Soft and questioning at first, then with a certainty that made my knees weak. "Can I see you tomorrow?" he asked, his forehead resting against mine. "Yes," I breathed, feeling like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. What followed was the most intense 3 months of my life. We spent weekends hiking in Cuyahoga Valley National Park, wading through streams and pointing out birds to each other. Weeknights were for cooking dinner in my small apartment, dancing barefoot to Van Morrison records, and talking about everything. Our childhoods, our dreams, our fears. By August, we were in love. The kind of love that feels like coming home to a place you've never been before but somehow recognize. We started making plans. He showed me sketches of a house he wanted to build someday, with big windows facing east to catch the morning light. I let him read chapters of the novel I'd been too afraid to share with anyone else. Then came the job offer in Portland. A chance to work with a prestigious firm, designing public spaces with environmental innovations that were years ahead of what anyone was doing in Cleveland. "It's only for a year," he promised. "I'll come back, or you could join me there. We'll figure it out." I believed him. We spent his last night together in my apartment, making promises between kisses. He would call every day. I would visit during Christmas break. We would write letters. Real ones, on paper. At the airport, he held me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I love you, Elizabeth Cooper," he whispered. "Wait for me." "I will," I promised. And I did. For 6 months. Until the calls became less frequent. Until the letters spoke more about his new projects, his new friends. Until "I miss you" was replaced by "you should see this place." Until he called one February night and told me, voice breaking, that he'd met someone else. That he was staying in Portland permanently. That he was sorry. "Did you ever really love me?" I asked through tears. A long pause. "I did. I do. But sometimes love isn't enough." I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor until morning, feeling as if everything bright and promising had been hollowed out of me. Now, 27 years later, I held his letter and wondered what remained of those 2 young people who had once thought love was enough for anything. The diocesan. For 3 days, Daniel's letter sat on my kitchen counter like a visitor who had arrived uninvited but couldn't be turned away. I circled it cautiously during my morning coffee, glanced at it while preparing dinner for one, and avoided it entirely before bed, when my defenses were lowest. On Thursday, my best friend Kathy came over bearing wine and Thai takeout, our monthly tradition since her divorce 5 years before mine. "You're distracted," she said, halfway through her pad Thai. "What's going on?" I hesitated, then retrieved the letter from its place by the coffee maker. Kathy had been there through it all. My marriage to Richard 2 years after Daniel left, the birth of my children, the slow unraveling of my marriage, and the painful rebuilding that followed. If anyone could offer perspective, it was her. She read silently, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," she finally said, folding the letter carefully. "Daniel Harmon. The one who got away. He didn't get away, Kath. He chose to leave. And now he wants to see you." She studied me over her wine glass. "The question is, do you want to see him?" I pushed my food around my plate. "I don't know. Part of me wants to tell him exactly what his leaving did to me. How long it took to trust anyone again. And the other part?" I sighed, feeling a familiar ache in my chest. "The other part is curious. What could he possibly have to say after all this time? Would I even recognize him now? Would he recognize me? Kathy reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Honey, you don't owe him anything. Not closure, not forgiveness, not even a response. I know. I took a sip of wine, letting the warmth spread through me. But maybe I owe it to myself to finally put this to rest. That night, after Kathy left, I found myself in front of my bedroom closet, reaching for the old hat box on the top shelf. Inside were the remnants of that summer. Dried wildflowers pressed between pages of books, ticket stubs from concerts, and a small stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. I hadn't opened them in decades, but I'd never been able to throw them away either. I untied the ribbon and began to read. His handwriting was so familiar. Slightly slanted, with looping G's and Y's. The early letters were full of longing and detailed descriptions of Portland, as if he were saving the city for me, one neighborhood at a time. In each one, a promise: this is temporary. I'll be home soon. Wait for me. The later ones grew shorter, the promises fewer. The last letter, dated a week before that February phone call, contained only 3 lines. I don't know how to write what I need to say. I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I never meant for this to happen. I put the letters away and went to the kitchen, where my phone lay next to his letter. Before I could second-guess myself, I dialed the number he'd provided. It rang 3 times before a deep voice answered, "Hello?" My heart hammered against my ribs. Daniel? It's Elizabeth. A sharp intake of breath. Elizabeth. He said my name the same way he always had, with a slight emphasis on the first syllable. I didn't think you'd call. I almost didn't, I admitted. I'm glad you did. His voice was older, rougher around the edges, but still unmistakably his. Does this mean you'll see me when I'm in town? I closed my eyes, seeing not the man on the phone but the young woman I'd been. Trusting, open-hearted, devastated by his betrayal. What would she want me to do? Yes, I found myself saying. But I'm not promising anything beyond coffee. Coffee is more than I deserve, he said quietly. Thank you, Elizabeth. After we arranged a time and place, I stood in my quiet kitchen, wondering if I'd just made a terrible mistake or taken the first step toward a resolution I didn't know I needed. The maple leaf that had fallen on my porch the day his letter arrived was now dried and curled at the edges. I picked it up gently and placed it between the pages of a book, a small memento of the day the past came knocking. The meeting, I changed outfits 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress and cardigan. Not too formal, not too casual. Nothing that screamed. I spent hours deciding what to wear to meet the man who broke my heart nearly 3 decades ago. We'd agreed to meet at a small cafe on the east side of town. Neutral territory, with enough ambient noise to fill any awkward silences. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table by the window, where I could see him approach. Part of me still expected him not to show. But at exactly 2 o'clock, a silver-haired man paused outside the cafe, looking in through the glass. My breath caught. Daniel's dark hair had gone completely silver, and lines had etched themselves around his eyes and mouth. He was thinner, his shoulders slightly stooped. But when our eyes met through the window, I recognized him instantly. He entered, making his way to my table with a slight hesitation in his step. Elizabeth, he said, his voice warm with something like reverence. I stood, unsure whether to shake his hand or offer a hug. We ended up doing an awkward half-embrace before sitting across from each other. You look beautiful, he said, studying my face. Exactly the same. I smiled despite myself. That's a kind lie. We both know 27 years changes people. Not your eyes, he insisted. They're still the same. A waitress appeared, saving me from having to respond. We ordered coffee, and I added a slice of lemon cake on impulse. Something solid to focus on when words failed. When she left, silence settled between us like a third companion at the table. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he finally said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't either," I admitted. "But I'm here." He nodded, fingers tracing the edge of his napkin. "I don't know where to begin." "Your letter mentioned a heart condition," I said, giving him an opening. "Yes." His fingers moved to his chest unconsciously. "Cardiomyopathy. My heart muscle doesn't pump as efficiently as it should. They've got me on medication, and I'm doing okay, but..." He shrugged. "It forces you to take stock." Our coffees arrived. I watched him add a single packet of sugar, just as he always had. "Some habits never change." "And taking stock led you to contact me," I prompted. He met my eyes directly. "Elizabeth, I've thought about you at least once every day for 27 years. The simple confession hung in the air between us. I broke off a piece of lemon cake, buying time. "That summer," he continued, "what we had. I've never felt anything like it, before or since." "Then why?" I began, but he raised a hand gently. "Please, let me try to explain. I know nothing I say can undo what happened, but I need you to understand." I nodded, steeling myself. "When I went to Portland, I was so sure of everything. Of us. Of my future." He took a sip of coffee. "But once I was there, everything I thought I wanted started shifting. The work was challenging in ways I never imagined. The city was vibrant and full of new ideas. And then there was Rebecca." My stomach clenched at the name. She was brilliant and passionate about the same things I was. We worked on projects together, stayed late discussing designs. He looked down. I told myself it was just friendship, but I think I knew even then that I was lying to myself. "You could have been honest with me sooner," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You're right. I should have been. But I kept thinking I could make the feelings go away, that what we had was stronger." He shook his head. By the time I admitted to myself what was happening, I was in too deep. Rebecca and I were already. He stopped, registering the pain that must have flashed across my face. "Anyway," he continued after a moment, "I told myself I was doing what was best for both of us. That you deserved someone who was certain, someone who wouldn't make you move across the country for a relationship that might not work. That wasn't your decision to make alone," I said quietly. "We could have talked about it. I could have had a say in my own future. I know that now." His voice was thick with regret. "I was a coward, Elizabeth. I was 28 and terrified of making the wrong choice. So I made the worst one possible. I hurt the person I cared about most." "What happened with her?" "With Rebecca?" I asked, needing to hear the rest. He smiled sadly. "We got married a year later. Had 2 sons. Things were good for a long time, then complicated, then not good. We divorced 12 years ago." I absorbed this information, thinking of my own failed marriage. Of how different our lives had turned out from what we'd once planned together. "And your children?" I asked. His face softened. "Tyler is 25, working as an engineer in Seattle. Jason is 22, still in college." He pulled out his phone, showing me photos of 2 young men with his eyes and jawline. "Your children?" "Emma is 20, studying journalism at Northwestern. Jake is 24, works in tech in Chicago." I showed him my own photos, this exchange of images somehow making our separate lives more real. "They're beautiful," he said. "You must be proud." "I am." I put my phone away. "Daniel, why are you really here? What did you hope would happen?" He looked out the window for a long moment. "Honestly? I don't know. When I got the diagnosis, all I could think about was regret. Not just about us, but all the choices I've made from fear instead of courage. He turned back to me. I guess I wanted to say I'm sorry, but that sounds so inadequate for the pain I caused you. It was a long time ago, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. We were young. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I'd stayed? Or if you'd come to Portland? The question I'd asked myself 1,000 times in the years after he left. Sometimes, I admitted. But that wondering doesn't change anything. We made our choices. We built our lives. He nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think I made the wrong choice. Not because things didn't work out with Rebecca, but because of how I handled everything with you. You deserved better. I felt a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying begin to lift. Thank you for saying that. We finished our coffee in a silence that felt less strained than before. As we prepared to leave, he asked, would it be all right if we kept in touch? Just as friends? I considered his question carefully. I think I'd like that, I said finally. But let's start slow. Outside the cafe, standing in the golden afternoon light, I saw not just the man who had broken my heart, but also the one who had once loved me with an intensity that had shaped all my relationships since. And I realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making peace with it. Goodbye, Daniel, I said, offering my hand. He took it, holding it between both of his. Not goodbye. Just, until next time. As I walked to my car, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying for decades without realizing its weight. Reflections. That night, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The temperature had dropped, bringing with it the crisp scent of autumn. A reminder that seasons change, that nothing remains the same forever. Meeting Daniel had been nothing like I'd imagined. In my mind, I'd played out scenarios where I was coldly distant or emotionally volatile. Where I finally got to tell him exactly how much damage his leaving had done. Where I showed him through my indifference that he no longer mattered. Instead, I'd found myself across from a man humbled by time and regret, seeking not to rekindle what was lost but simply to acknowledge that it had mattered. My phone chimed with a text from Emma. How was your day, Mom? Such an innocent question. How could I possibly explain? Good, I typed. Had coffee with an old friend. It wasn't a lie, exactly. But it wasn't the whole truth either. My thoughts drifted back to the years after Daniel, to my marriage to Richard. He'd been kind and steady, a high school principal who loved routine and predictability. We'd built a good life together, raised 2 wonderful children. But there had always been something missing. A spark, a sense of possibility, the feeling that life could surprise you in beautiful ways. When Richard confessed to his affair with his administrative assistant, I was less heartbroken than I was angry at having settled for something less than what I truly wanted. The divorce was amicable but exhausting, leaving me wary of relationships and protective of the new independence I'd found. Now, sipping my wine under the stars, I wondered if meeting Daniel had reopened old wounds or begun to heal them at last. My phone rang, startling me. Kathy's name flashed on the screen. Well, she demanded without preamble. How was it? Do I need to come over with more wine and a shoulder to cry on? I laughed. No, I'm okay. Actually, it was good. Healing, in a way. Healing? She sounded skeptical. The man breaks your heart into 1,000 pieces, disappears for nearly 30 years, then shows up with a my bad and that's healing? It wasn't like that, I said, trying to explain. He wasn't looking for absolution or a second chance. He just wanted to acknowledge what happened between us, to say he was sorry for how he handled it. And are you? Sorry, I mean? I considered her question. For loving him? No. For how long I carried the hurt? Maybe. I took another sip of wine. You know what I realized today? I've been using what happened with Daniel as an excuse for not fully investing in relationships since my divorce. As if his leaving somehow proved I wasn't meant for that kind of love. "Oh, honey," Kathy said softly. But seeing him today, this older, more vulnerable version of him, made me realize we're all just doing our best. Your strength, your kindness, your capacity for forgiveness. I'll be in Cleveland for another week. If you'd like to meet again, I'd love to hear more about your life, your writing, your children. But I'll understand if yesterday was enough. Either way, I'm grateful for the chance to see you again. Daniel. I sat with the email for hours, considering what I wanted. Not out of obligation or curiosity this time, but out of a genuine desire to know who this man had become. And perhaps to show him who I had become as well. Finally, I typed a response. "Daniel, yesterday was unexpected in many ways. I went looking for closure and found something else instead, a chance to reframe a story I've been telling myself for too long. I'd like to meet again, perhaps for a walk in the park where we used to hike. The leaves are turning, and it's beautiful this time of year." Elizabeth. As I pressed send, a maple leaf drifted down outside my window, spinning in the morning light, not an ending, but a natural progression from one season to the next. Beginnings. We met at the entrance to Cuyahoga Valley National Park the following Saturday, both dressed for hiking in jeans and light jackets. The morning air was cool but promised to warm as the sun rose higher, burning through the light mist that hung over the trees. "I haven't been here in years," Daniel said as we set off down a familiar trail. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is." Around us, the forest was a tapestry of red, gold, and lingering green. Leaves crunched underfoot, releasing their earthy scent with each step. We walked in comfortable silence at first, finding our rhythm on the gentle incline. "Do you remember that time we got caught in the thunderstorm here?" I asked after a while, smiling at the memory. Daniel laughed, the sound echoing among the trees. "How could I forget? We took shelter under that rocky overhang and watched the lightning across the valley. You said it was like watching the earth and sky having a conversation." "I was so poetic in my 20s, I said with a self-deprecating laugh. "You were," he agreed. "Are you still writing?" The question touched a tender spot. "Not really. I started a few things over the years, but with teaching and the kids." I shrugged. "Life gets in the way." "I saw your name on a book once," he said quietly. "In a bookstore in Portland, about 15 years ago. A collection of short stories. I bought it immediately." I stopped walking, surprised. "You read my book?" He nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I read it twice, actually." "Your stories were beautiful, Elizabeth. Full of such keen observation and compassion." "That collection barely sold 1,000 copies," I said, touched that he'd not only found it but read it. "Well, I was responsible for at least 2 of those sales. I gave my copy to Tyler when he started showing an interest in literature." He hesitated. "Your story about the woman who releases monarch butterflies every summer in memory of her mother." It made him cry. Me too. We resumed walking, but something had shifted between us. The knowledge that while our lives had diverged, there had been this unexpected connection, my words in his hands, in his son's hands, created a new bridge across the years we'd spent apart. "What about you?" I asked. "Did your work fulfill you the way you hoped?" He considered the question as we navigated around a fallen tree. "Yes and no. I designed some parks and public spaces I'm proud of. Places where people can connect with nature in the middle of urban environments." He smiled ruefully. "But the politics of big firms wore me down. The last 10 years, I've been working independently, taking on smaller projects that matter to me." "Like what?" "Community gardens in underserved neighborhoods. Schoolyards redesigned as natural play spaces. A healing garden at a children's hospital." His eyes lit up as he described these projects, his hands sketching shapes in the air. I realized I was seeing the Daniel I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Passionate, idealistic, committed to making the world more beautiful and humane. That core of him had remained intact, despite all the changes time had brought. We reached a clearing that offered a panoramic view of the valley below, trees stretching to the horizon in a patchwork of autumn colors. By unspoken agreement, we sat on a fallen log, catching our breath and taking in the vista. I never imagined us here, Daniel said after a while. Older, with grown children, looking back on lives we built separately. What did you imagine? I asked, genuinely curious. He gazed out over the valley. That house I designed. The one with the east-facing windows. I imagined us there, watching the sunrise together on Sunday mornings. A garden you'd tend while I built furniture in a workshop out back. Children running through rooms filled with books and music. He glanced at me. It was a good dream. It was, I agreed softly. The gentle acknowledgement of what might have been hung between us, not as a regret but as a recognition of a path not taken. And now? I asked. What do you dream about now? He smiled, a hint of his old mischief returning. Practically? A little cabin somewhere quiet where I can sketch and read. Maybe teach some workshops for young designers. He paused. But if I'm being completely honest, this diagnosis has made me dream bigger in some ways. There are places I still want to see, things I want to experience while I can. Such as the Northern Lights, the coast of Portugal, the cherry blossoms in Japan. He turned to face me fully. I want to live more boldly, Elizabeth. Make choices from courage rather than fear. Something in his words resonated deeply with me. Hadn't I been living cautiously since my divorce? Taking the safe path, avoiding risk? I understand that, I said. After Richard and I split, I promised myself I'd finally live on my own terms. But it's easier said than done. What would living on your own terms look like for you? He asked. I considered the question seriously. Writing again, for one thing. Not worrying about publication or success, just creating for the joy of it. I smiled. Traveling, maybe. I've always wanted to see Greece. And I hesitated, then decided to be honest. Being open to connection again. Not just romantic relationships, but genuine friendships, community. I've kept people at a distance for too long. Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's never too late to begin again, is it? I hope not, I said, and meant it. We continued our hike, talking about our children, our work, the books we'd read and music we'd discovered over the years. By the time we returned to the parking lot, the sun was high and warm, and something new had taken root between us. Not the passionate connection of our youth, but something equally valuable, a friendship built on shared history and mutual respect. As we prepared to say goodbye beside our cars, Daniel said, I'm heading back to Portland tomorrow. So soon? I tried to hide my disappointment. My cardiologist doesn't like me traveling for extended periods, he explained. But I've been thinking, I'd like to keep in touch. Really keep in touch this time, not just say we will. I'd like that too, I said. He smiled, relief evident in his face. Good. And maybe, if you're ever in Portland, or if I'm back this way. Yes, I said simply. I'd like that. We hugged goodbye, a proper embrace this time, and I felt the solid reality of him. Older, frilier perhaps, but still Daniel. Still the man who had once shown me how deeply I could love. Take care of that heart, I said as we pulled apart. I will. His eyes held mine. You take care of yours too. As I drove home, windows down to let in the crisp autumn air, I felt an unexpected lightness. The past hadn't changed. Daniel had still left, I had still married Richard, we had both built lives apart from each other. But somehow, seeing Daniel again had freed me from the narrative I'd constructed around that pain. It wasn't about forgiveness, exactly. It was about understanding that our paths had diverged for reasons that made sense at the time, even if those reasons seemed insufficient in hindsight. It was about accepting that love, even when it doesn't last, can still be true while it exists. At home, I opened my laptop and began to write again, not about Daniel, but about a woman in her 50s who discovers that endings are often disguised beginnings. Words flowed easily, as if they'd been waiting all this time for me to make space for them again. Outside my window, the maple tree stood half golden, half green. A perfect metaphor for this moment in my life. Not fully transformed, but changing. Becoming something new while honoring what came before. My phone chimed with a text from Daniel, made it back to my sisters safely. Thank you for today. For everything. I smiled and typed back, safe travels tomorrow. This isn't goodbye. And for the first time in 27 years, I believed that the past could be a foundation rather than a weight. Something to build upon rather than carry. That autumn, as the leaves turned and fell and made way for whatever would come next, I began to do the same.